Hello, good evening everyone. I do apologise for being late. Obviously this is we've been practicing over the past couple of days for what happens in a society without fossil fuels, where the infrastructure breaks down completely and we all have to fend for ourselves. So it's been instructive certainly, but I do apologise for making you the victims of it this evening. So, as we've been saying, here to talk about peak oil, a really excellent panel, I think, to talk about it. Firstly, on my far left here, Jeremy Legget, who I had the pleasure of introducing on a panel only about, when was that, about a week ago. Yeah. We must stop meeting like this, when he was described as Britain's leading green entrepreneur, which I think is very fair and very reasonable. And now, sorry, I forget, of Solar Century, I forget your correct title. Are you the founder there and also chief exec?
And
yeah.
chairman.
And chairman, yeah, absolutely. And then on my immediate left, Simon Taylor, director of Global Witness. And on my right, Manouchehr Takin of the Centre for Global Energy Studies. I'm sorry, I forget your title there. You are...
Well, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
There are analysts there somewhere.
You're
Expert.
Indeed. Absolutely. Extremely eminent expert, Clay. And so I don't know if we've got a speaking order, but perhaps why don't we go round in the order. I think the idea is that everyone's going to talk a little bit to introduce themselves and to introduce their position, and then hopefully we'll get a good free-flowing debate going. And as I've been saying, we've got a bit more than an hour, I hope, so we should be able to get plenty of questions in and hear a lot of different points of view from everyone out there as well as us up here. So perhaps, Jeremy, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, okay. Let me just add a little bit to what Ed said, in case you're wondering why a green entrepreneur is talking about peak oil and thinking, well, he might say that, mightn't he, because he wants to sell solar panels. I get that a lot. I was a creature of the oil industry for 11 years. I taught at the Royal School of Mines. I consulted left, right and centre with the industry in a number of different countries, and I actually worked on oil source rocks, funded, I am now, with the benefit of hindsight, deeply ashamed to say, by BP and Shell. But I was really very much one of them, and I was converted by, the March events and climate change to the types of things that drive what I want to do now. Anyway, just to introduce where I come from on this issue, about a year ago, I convened an industry task force on the principle that it's all very well to have opinions of your own, and I've written a little book on the issue of peak oil called Half Gone. But actually, in this world, it's much more useful if you can sort of speak as part of a group. And so as an experiment, I went to some other business leaders in companies actually much bigger than Solar Century and put together this task force. It ran for a year, and we studied the problem of peak oil with regular meetings. There were 8 companies in the group, including Virgin, Scottish and Southern, it was the biggest energy company, Yahoo, Stagecoach, a couple of the other transport companies, Foster's, the architects. So a broad spectrum of British industry, and we produced a report that was published in October, released at the Stock Exchange. And we do think that there is a clear and present danger from this problem. And obviously I'm not going to be able to give you a PowerPoint presentation on the arguments in the report, but I just want to go through the top line reasoning of this in 30 seconds or so. But first of all, just to put it in context, I think one of the ways to imagine the sense of frustration that one gets as a believer that there is a problem in this and that the evidence is actually really compelling is to imagine that 5 years ago, a group of 8 companies across British industry had said, you know what, in 5 years' time, because the financial sector, the banks particularly, have got their asset assessment systemically and dangerously wrong, there's going to be a global financial crisis. Had that happened then, maybe 1 or 2 people might have listened, and we could have done a few proactive things to deflate the bubble a bit quicker, a bit slower than it did deflate. Well, that's what we're saying now. We're saying the oil and gas industry globally, not because of any conspiracy or anything like that, just culturally, has got its asset assessment fundamentally and dangerously wrong. And of course, we hope we're wrong in this assessment, and that's why we wrote the report, so people can weigh our arguments. But be clear on one thing: if you don't remember anything else from tonight, please be aware that this is not a lone set of voices. It's 8 companies with multiple billion market cap. We are far from alone. And if you read one document apart from our report, I would recommend the World Energy Outlook by the International Energy Agency this year. For a number of years, till 2006, the International Energy Agency poo-pooed all this concern. They just think oil production is going to keep rising in our fundamentally oil-addicted world economy, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. This year, you can hear the alarm bells screaming from between the lines of this report. And maybe we'll get into it a bit in discussion. But so the analogy is, it's not just these 8 companies, but the equivalent of the World Bank 5 years ago saying, you know, the industry's got its asset assessment wrong. And I just, because, you know, we're under instructions just to talk for a couple of minutes at the outset before the debate, the one thing that we did in the report was take an expert opinion. Actually, we took 2. We asked Shell to contribute, not as a member of the task force, but to write a chapter on what they thought was going to happen with global oil production. And then we asked one of the well-known authoritative advocates of the problem, the consulting editor of Petroleum Review, actually an industry journal, to come up with what his team think as their latest assessment. And that's the thing I draw your attention to, because what they do in our report is plot the flow rates of reported oil industry projects. In other words, oil fields that have been found, that are being developed. And of course, every oil field takes time to develop, actually a surprising amount of time. The average is 6.5 years, it turns out, from the moment you discover oil to the first oil coming into the market. And what he does is plot the industry's own recorded data on when oil is coming to the market. And you can see the depletion rate in the existing fields, which is alarmingly fast, plotted against the known discoveries and how they come into the market. And what you find is that for the next few years, thankfully, we're going to be okay. Supply is going to keep meeting demand. But then in 2013, at the latest in 2013, assuming a rise in global demand of 1.6%, which is the IEA figure, it's a conservative figure, you will drop below the point at which you're meeting demand. And then there'll be an oil shock, the mother of all oil shocks, the third one, the worst of them, if this analysis is correct. And as I say, it's just one. I've got 12 bullet points from the report that maybe we'll get to in the discussion. This is just one argument, and you can see in the data, the reported data, that this is coming and will hit us. And it will be an oil shock. It's quite a young audience, so probably not so many people remember the previous 2 oil shocks in the 1970s that well. But you know, they were tough times for the world. They were both followed by recessions. This one, if the analysis is right, is going to be worse. And for some countries, oil-consuming countries, it will be experienced not as an oil crisis, but as an oil famine, an energy famine, because the producers are likely, if the analysis is correct, to start keeping more and more of the diminishing resource for their own multi-hundred-billion-dollar infrastructure programs, which of course themselves are heavily oil dependent. And if you just want to be worried about one thing, just look at what Saudi Arabia is planning in terms of electricity supply for its massive infrastructure programs, quite rightly trying to use their petrodollars to build infrastructure for their population, big new towns, cities in the desert, massive electricity demand, and increasingly they're planning to be burning oil in the power plants to drive that. So this is I think enough by way of a flavour for our concerns, but we have many others that I think I imagine will come out in the debate. I think I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Simon Taylor.
I don't know if I've got this in the right place.
For those of you who don't know Global Witness, we're a London-based NGO. We've spent, I guess, since our inception really focusing on the consequences of the struggle for natural resources between different competing groups. Many of the areas we've looked at have been approached less from the natural resource point of view, but from the point of view of conflicts that are in those countries and the role of the natural resources in driving those conflicts. So I won't go into lots of detail there. Maybe some of that will come out in the course of the discussion, just to try and keep it a little bit brief. The last decade or so, I've focused on the role of oil in conflicts. The role of oil in conflicts and asset stripping, I would say, state theft, state looting. And there's a very complicated discussion to be had around that. But some of you will be familiar with the civil war, for example, that was going on in Angola, that started with the independence struggle and then struggled through various different incarnations. By the time we joined the fray, as it were, we started looking at, first of all, the role of diamonds. And so we're the organisation that launched the conflict diamond issue. Now, the other side of the Angolan conflict was oil and the role of oil and the way in which the government basically stole assets off the top of the arms supply process to fuel the conflict. Now, you might be saying, what's that got to do with peak oil? Well, the reason state looting became a real issue in Angola was primarily down to the way in which competition started to build over who had access to concessions in a post-Clinton coming into the White House world, where the United States swapped sides. So until Clinton came in, the United States had pretty much had backed Jonas Savimbi's struggle. And at the point when the elections collapsed in more fighting in 1992 and the Civil War kicked off again, we had a swapping of sides. And the result of that was considerable concessions given out to US companies, which the French, in particular through the interests of ELF, were very troubled by. They started to lose out. And so what we saw was the beginning of I would say, a metamorphosis away from what had been going on before and into a really big competitive push between US interests and French interests. And it resulted in the involvement of all sorts of individuals I won't go into now, but who created a system that was first of all about delivering weapons in return for concessions, but later became the vehicle for looting tens of billions of dollars out of the country. And this process is basically still going on. Now, here we are now, a few years after the end of the civil war in Angola. Angola remains the worst place to be born pretty much in the world. There's been no change on the Human Development Index. And I'm just talking about one country. There are loads of countries in the Gulf of Guinea and other places we've looked at where similar conditions prevail. And where these circumstances have really blown up have always been in the cases where you have unfettered competition. And so in the course of this work, we launched in 2002 the Publish What You Pay campaign, which was about trying to bring accountability around the revenue streams such that civil society, local communities could start the process of holding their governments accountable for these large revenue streams. And the UK government reacted by launching something called the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which is now a kind of global process that involves producer and consumer governments. It involves civil society. The Publish What You Pay network is now, I think, 380 civil society organisations around the world, and also the international oil, gas, and they brought mining into the equation, so oil, gas, and mining. And we have a process which is about delivering revenue transparency and accountability around these massive rents. So just go back to the Angolan example for a minute. We're talking a country which has something like 85 to 90% of state income is oil, and you can't really work out how to hold government accountable if you don't know where these streams are coming from. Now, during the course of this work, it was impossible not to bump into the discussion more or less outlined by Jeremy just now. And some time ago, for me, I bumped into that, and I didn't really feel equipped, if you like, to understand it well enough. I was too busy fighting this struggle, this no-brainer that should companies be accountable for the revenue streams or not. It seemed very obvious, but the fight was quite extraordinary. And I never really had time to look at it. And then I'd say about 2 years ago, we started to look at the consequences of climate change and how the consequences of runaway climate change would likely very much threaten almost everything we were doing around governance reform, around whether or not conflicts were going on, around trying to save forests and so on in various places. And we came to the conclusion that, you know, unless something dramatic happened to address climate change, then almost everything that we were working on was going to be undermined, in which case maybe we should look to see what skill sets we have that could be deployed. And so in the course of that, of course, I would put myself in the camp of someone who's done enough reading around and talking to enough people to be convinced by the arguments that Jeremy's putting across. And so I guess I come to you today not as an expert, as a geologist, but as a person who's seen the consequences for the struggle around resources and how those play out in terms of destroyed futures, in terms of really totally unsustainable development in various countries, and how, you know, if we get to the point where there's a difference between absolute demand, I qualify that not in terms of increasing demand where our economies expand in this oil-addicted world you're talking about, but in a world where there is a kind of minimum flexibility of demand here, beneath which we start to price people out of the market for the current needs of oil. People here will be aware of food riots last year, I think 47 countries in the end. And yes, there's lots of reasons for that, including obviously biofuels competition. But I think one of the reasons we probably can't discount is the price of oil and how that impacted on agriculture. And, you know, so some of those consequences you know, come to bear by you know, by an increasing price that we will have if we have an incapacity of supply to meet demand. Now, but if we get to a world where supply simply can't meet demand and it starts dropping, I could very easily imagine a scenario where a group of countries or a big powerhouse might decide, because we haven't frankly moved at all in the direction of an alternative energy paradigm, to seize an area for their own requirements, because the maths doesn't add up. The choice will be there isn't enough, or we will access what we need. But before we get to that stage, and I find that a particularly a potentially disturbing outcome, I think all of the governance work that's gone around EITI and all of the consequences in countries where we haven't even got any performance under EITI will go by the wayside. We will, I think, very likely see an increased competition that will result in, I'm going to have that concession and I'm going to get it, and I'm going to do it by paying illicit funds. And so I think the entire governance structure we've been working on pretty much for the last decade will be severely undermined, and I think we will still fail in our efforts to get those resources because we're going down, and the end game will be potentially escalating local conflicts and then potentially interregional conflicts. So the question I pose is this: how on earth, given the, I can't describe it any other way, pedestrian effort at addressing the climate crisis we have, how on earth is our political infrastructure going to cope with that, whilst we're simultaneously looking at every possible method to get hold of every last bit of energy from oil, the ultimate resource we need? I think that the politics gets very mucky very quick. So for me, the end game is we need to move, and we need to move out of what we currently do, and we need to do it very fast. Start with that.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks for that. But first, Manouchehr, Takin, your thoughts.
Well, with pleasure. As an introduction, I work at the Center for Global Energy Studies. This is in number 17 Knightsbridge. We have been there 19 years now. It is an independent think tank. Sheikh Yamani, who was the Saudi oil minister before for 20-something years, he has established it. It is a non-profit, non-commercial organization. We try to understand the energy problem, oil problem, from a rather independent point of view, not from the point of an oil company or OPEC or consuming importing country like Japan and others who also do research on understanding oil and energy. That is what I've been there for 19 years. Before that, I did work actually for oil exploration and development with Amoco, Ultramar. I'm Iranian. I worked in Iran. I'm working on well sites, etc. in my career. And also worked in OPEC Secretariat 9 years trying to analyze for the economists and the policy makers the ups and downs and problems about the oil market, what to do, etc., as a technical analyst. This is the background. Now we come back to the peak oil, which is the main topic of the evening. To tell you my own personal prejudices or my own beliefs to share with you, I think peak oil is a reality, is a truism. It will happen. Oil is a finite resource quantity, which became, organic materials became fossilized and in geological history, millions of years, tens of millions, and so on, and generated this liquid down the earth, and we go and look for it. And the more we find, the more difficult it is to find the rest. So peak oil is a reality which happened. I think the debate is really when it will happen. Some people think we already have reached a peak in oil production, and others think, no, it will be 10, 20, even 30, 40, 50 years ahead. To give you a bit of feeling again, since late 19th century that oil was discovered in the United States, in Pennsylvania, these Gusher wells coming out. A few years later, the flow stopped, and people thought, it's running out of oil. There's no more to be found. The price went up, and so on. And then later on, they found oil in Oklahoma, in Texas, East Texas field, a huge field, and the price came down to 1 cent or 2 cents. This cycle of world running out of oil and yet finding more oil has been repeating itself, for more than a century. And I think the experience of the geologists and petroleum engineers who have worked hard is that you cannot find oil that easily. There are people like Dr. Campbell and Monsieur Legget. These are the proponents of peak oil. I know them for many years. I respect them very much. They are honorable professionals. They have worked around the world looking for oil. They find it difficult. They have had many dry wells that they have had salt water. Millions and millions have been spent, only salt water discovered. They have discovered oil, tight reservoir, doesn't flow. They have to have billions of other techniques to get the oil out. So based on this, they think that one cannot continue producing oil and increasing production, meeting this demand that the world is having, the consumer society around the world. They are the actual proponents of peak oil. Of course, the idea is appealing to journalists, to economists, and others around the world, and they took on it, and like we have heard tonight, this is quite legitimate. As a feeling of crisis, something is happening, they have to be quick and do something about it, etc., etc. Sense of crisis. But my belief is that there is not really a sense of crisis, and things would manage themselves. Now, there are two sides in this debate. One are the people like I just mentioned, Dr. Campbell and others, who started this peak oil debate from their own experience, and they say we cannot keep finding oil and producing it. There is a limit. And they are right, because it's a finite quantity. On the other hand, the other side of the debate have been economists who have been sitting in the back and looking for the 1 century of oil industry, and they say, well, you technical people have all been telling us oil is running out, and yet you yourselves, using ingenuity and technology and so on, have been finding more oil 10 years later, and oil production has gone on. So as economists looking at the oil industry, making analysis, they think, no, this is not correct, and more and more oil will be found. So this is the issue of the debate. And both of them are right, both the technical industry people and those who are looking from outside. Those from outside are given different names, and this debate used to be healthy, unfortunately became unhealthy, very emotional, like religious, fervor against each other. About 10 years ago, I was in International Energy IEA in Paris, and these people were there, and Michael Lynch was there, and Professor Edelman from MIT, and I was invited as well, about 15 people. We had all day. Instead of good debate, Colin Campbell put a picture and said, this is Christopher Columbus wanting to get money from the King of Spain to go and find India the other way. And the others were saying, no, Earth is flat, and this is wrong. And so he said, you people who don't believe in peak oil, you are flat Earth believers. And this, of course, caused very unpleasant meetings between Professor Adam and Michael Lynch. Those of you who followed this debate, you know these people. And I think that is, the issue that we have had, unfortunately, suffering in this debate on peak oil. My point of view, just for your explanation, I believe both of them are correct, that oil will run out, as I said at the beginning, but there is more and more ingenuity, technology, ways and means that we have been finding oil. In 1960, if I remember, 300 million barrels were the so-called reported remaining oil in the world. By 2000, we had produced 760 billion barrels of oil actually between 1960 and 2000. Whereas in 1960, the reported reserves were 300 billion. And if you look at you follow, as we heard here, that these statistics are exaggerated, even the 300 billion must have been incorrect, must have been less. And yet, 40 years later, we had produced 760 billion barrels. And yet the reported reserves, I say reported inverted comma because you may agree on the accuracy, in 2000 was more than 1,000 billion barrels. You see, so oil would have run out by that numbers in 1960, and yet 40 years later, we had produced so much, and yet there was so much in the inventory reported, and so on. So whether we can continue repeating this experience on and on, I think, as I said at the beginning, I do agree generally that this cannot go on forever, and we will run out of oil one day. But I want to emphasize the role of technology, application of science and technology industry has advanced so much in the last 30, 40 years in every branch. Applying these to oil exploration and production has opened so many venues, and so much that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, always were unthinkable, and yet they have developed as research, pilot operations, and on industrial scale, and we are getting more and more oil, finding more and more oil, and producing more and more oil. Looking at the North Sea here, UK, Norwegian side, the classic look at for the oil, when the people looking 1960s, early 70s, was to look for Jurassic and Cretaceous source reservoir rock. That was the target. So you used to drill looking for that. They used to go through the other younger horizons. But gradually later on, they're looking for these big structural traps, faults. And they did discover all these big fields in the North Sea. But about 15 years later, some clever geologists, they said, well, these layers that you are passing through, why didn't you look at them? And in Paleocene, higher ones, they found they look at the logs and data and here and there, then some bigger new oil fields have been discovered since then in the horizons, shallower ones, in other ones. Buzzard was another. Instead of big folds, they look for stratigraphic traps. And this is a technical geological term, a different concept of looking for oil. And they did discover these fields in Kana. This is about 4 years ago. So there are these cases that one can find more oil, and on a very broad brush statement. There are the 5 continents around in the world, and then there are the oceans. Ocean depth is about 6 kilometers of water. And between the continent and the great depth, there's a huge pile of sediment. Of course, if you go look on the map, be careful, there is a continental shelf. But there is water, but there's still continuation of the continent. And we have found oil in those. These are shell like North Sea itself. This is not in the ocean, this is still continent. I'm not talking beyond continental shelf. Going to the depth of ocean, 6 kilometer depth of water, there is a huge pile of sediment. Just imagine around the continents, thick wedge of sediment, prism of sediment, from the edge of the continental shelf down to the bottom of the ocean. And this pile of sediments around all the continents has been explored only in few occasions, or few areas. One has been the West Africa, Angola and others. And in the last 4 or 5 years, ultra deep water discoveries have been made in going down, and huge billions and billions of barrels have been discovered. On the Brazilian side, which is, if you believe in continental drift, of Africa and South America were once splitting together, they have the same thing, the mirror image. They have found again deep water and huge billions of barrels of sediments. And the last year, they had announced in Brazil that going down to a depth of 3,000 meters, if I remember, of water, and going down another 3,000 meters below a thick layer of salt, they have found oil again. Here and there, and the seismic data, they say it could be 100 billion barrels, like the North Sea again. So these are cases, and there are so many other smaller examples. The Troll gas field in the North Sea, which is a major gas field in the Norwegian side, but it had a layer of oil underneath it. Industry thought that this is not really worthwhile. Commercially, you can't get this oil out. But the Norwegian government, and the way they supervise the oil industry, they made them to go and look. And that layer of oil from Troll has been being producing, I think if I remember, 1.7 billion barrels of oil is now the reserve, most of it being produced in this gas field, the huge gas field offshore Norway. So these are cases I'm telling you that there are ways and means of discovering more oil and getting more oil out, the Arctic basins and so on. So it is not the issue of the resource, the potential of oil. Some has been discovered, and all these sedimentary basins have potential for finding more oil. I think I come back and I agree generally with the panel's comments that the issue really is whether the governments, the companies, and so on are prepared to go and invest. Because this is like basic, uncharted territory. To go and look for oil in these areas, you have to spend a lot of money. You have to apply huge investments. We had 6 years, it could be 10, 15 years before you start, even 20 years, that you have to spend 4 or 5 billion barrels over the next 5 years as a super major oil company. And the result of what could be asset in your books as reserves and a production of so many thousand barrels, etc., to compete with your competitors as supply of oil, you're talking about a lead time of 15 years or even longer. It is this that the management of the oil industry have fallen into the short-termism trap. They are only concerned about the share value and what they do, the CEOs, for the next few years, and they want to reduce costs. They have even reduced the inventories of oil. In the 1990s, people were talking about zero stock oil. This is, of course, aside from this peak oil, but just for your interest, that because if you keep oil in the inventories to meet demand, if there's up and down, this huge inventory will cost. It is like a working capital. And in order to reduce cost, in the 1990s, people reduced more and more oil companies, the value of commercial stocks. And so when there was a fluctuation in demand, they couldn't meet it. See? So they had gone too far. Even in operations of oil that they know exist, that they are producing it, the inventory policy, management policy of the oil industry, look what big companies. They became so careful because of the pressure of the financial sectors, the statements that they have to give at the every 6 months, every quarter statements, and the review by the city, etc., to reduce the working capital and inventories, that it became critical, and so on. And on the same argument, this is a real case, on the same argument, my feeling is that they're not going around and investing. They are too careful, are not prepared to take risks. And that is, I think, the issue. And on the other countries, they say, well, when we talk to the international oil companies, when you meet Mr. the Manouchehr, when you go to Norway, he would say, well, we have technology, we are prepared to invest, Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and so on, don't let us in, and that's it. They complain that the access to the cheap oil is closed by them. Well, that is not an argument to find oil. And when you look at Saudi Arabia and others, then you can say, well, Saudi Arabians have reportedly 260 million barrels. You may disagree, say it is 200 million, 150 million. It's a huge quantity of oil. Are they developing it? Are they bringing these fields on the stream? And they are not doing it. Of course, I don't want to blame them. If you look at to discuss with them, they say, look at the price of oil, which has fallen in the last few months, and that Saudi Arabia and other countries have to reduce their production by 3, 4, 5 million barrels per day. So why should we invest, talking what the Saudis are saying or others, why should we invest billions of dollars and then when the demand comes down have to close it down? Now, to finalize one point, yes, just to finalize my point, that as well as supply, let us think of demand. And that I think that another point that many people forget is that demand for oil is not going to continue forever at these high rates. We have all become conscious of too much wastage, being profligate, being wastage, and spending and wasting too much of energy and oil. And in general, the use of oil and energy is coming down. And conservation is becoming more and more popular in spite of its costs. United States economy, to produce 1 unit of GDP, say $1,000 in real terms, was using the amount of oil that it uses now, before this decline, for 2007, was more than 50% greater, less than 50% less than the number of barrels that it was using in 1970. United States uses a quarter of world oil, and there is room for even further conservation and reduction of oil use in the U.S. economy, let alone when we go to developing countries that are using so much energy. So I think the issue of demand, I think, is really the crux of the matter, and the demand for oil could actually come down before we reach to the peak and the crisis of supply. That's it, my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'm going to throw it open to the floor in just a moment. Just before I do, Jeremy, perhaps if you wanted to come back on a couple of things I was struck by there. One, crisis, there is no crisis.
Right.
And two, something I think is a very interesting point about the nature of the debate and the tone of the debate, which is sometimes unproductive, Mr. Takin thought, and I think he may have a point.
Yes. No crisis, no crisis. There were in there, I think, three main sub-arguments that you made, and feel free to interrupt me at any point if you feel I'm misrepresenting you. The first one was the technology point, that we get this a lot, that actually the industry is incredibly inventive. It can lift the productivity of oil fields dramatically with wonderful kit. You know, they can drill horizontally, they can squirt all kinds of fluids down and lift the production, and it's all true. They can. It's quite remarkable. And our concern about all that is twofold, really. The first is most of these techniques were invented in and around Houston and Dallas and have been thrown at the downslope of domestic US oil production. As you may know, in the United States, the production peaked in 1970, as long ago as 1970, and it's been descending very fast ever since. And the Americans have thrown this array of battery of techniques at enhanced oil recovery. It's made a difference. It's slowed the fall, but not that you notice. It's still dramatic. And we see, of course, the implications of that for US foreign policy. Let's explore that no further. But, you know, this is our concern about enhanced oil recovery. The next point was about you can find more oil. More oil is being found. Extra fields in the North Sea, big fields off Brazil. Statistically, though, if you look at the rate of discovery of oil fields, the peak of when they were discovered was in the mid-1960s. And this is Exxon data. This is not, you know, the data of the peakists, if you like, the gentlemen who accuse people of being flat earthers. And it's been declining ever since. So in any country, in any province, the really big oil fields tend to get found first. And so an awful lot of the world's oil now is being produced from fields that are 40, 50, and even 60 years old. And this is a real concern. The average size of discovery of an oil field at the moment in the world is 50 million barrels or thereabouts. That's less than a day's supply. And they're not being found that often. You can see, of course it wiggles around, but you can see, we're not allowed to use graphics, but if you could see this graphic, those of you who haven't, it's one of the most striking things. It wiggles its way up to 1965. This is longer ago than, you know, England last won the World Cup. And then it comes down, and it's, with all the kit they have, everything they can do, it's still coming down. And so we worry about that. And then there's the issue of the flow rates. And here, towards the end, there were some things you were saying that I totally agree with. And this is one of the reasons why the task force and the people who worry about peak oil are so worried, because at the end of the day, even if it's down there, and we have doubts about that for all sorts of reasons we won't have time to go into in detail tonight, even if it's down there, it doesn't matter. It's like having money in a bank account that you can never get out. It's how quickly you can get the productive flows into the economy. Because peak oil at the end of the day is where you can no longer replace depletion in the oil fields you've already found with the rate at which you bring on productive flows of new oil. And once you cross over that, you're going on a downslope. In an oil-addicted economy that's expecting demand to rise on into the future, you're on a downslope, on a widening gap. And that's what we're worried about. And that's what we think is coming on our watch before 2013. And here, so it's all about the flow rates. Even if you doubt some of the peakists' arguments about how much oil there is down there, it's about the flow rates they can bring in. And I really recommend the report to you because, you know, it's all charted there and it drops off in 2013. And then if you don't know much about oil, you might say, well, so what? They'll go out tomorrow and they'll find more and they'll bring between now and 2013. That's, you know, quite away from now. They'll bring more on stream. And I think there are quite a few economists in the world who would probably say that. You know, the oil price has been high. There has been quite a bit of loose cash around in the companies. Go out, find more oil, plug the gap. That's where the 6.5-year average comes in. And as you said yourself, You know, when you find a big field, Kashagan, the biggest field to have been found for an awful long time in the Caspian Sea, they found it in 2000, and it was due to come on stream in 2005. Anyone care to guess when the latest estimate for it to come on stream is? 2013. That's, you know, that's the point about flow rates. And then the issue of demand, that's a good one, because of course herein lies, when we get to the solutions, herein lies, you know, the scope, a big part of the scope we have to turn this whole thing into a silver lining to the clouds. I wish I could believe that, you know, we could demand manage our way out of this problem. You know, belatedly in America, now we have a president who's just said 35 miles a gallon, please, mandated as of as soon as you can get the legislation through. In China and India, last year, demand was growing respectively between 5–7%, and the IEA, you know, summing all the data up, the demand management in the developed world, you know, looks at this kind of stuff coming from the developing economies, and that's where it comes up with its figure of 1.6% demand growth going into the future. Even if that slows, there's still a problem, a massive problem, with replacing the rate of depletion. And if you look at that World Energy Outlook report of the IEA, you'll see oil fields that they've charted this year for the first time. They've gone field by field around the world, 800 of the biggest oil fields in the world. And you can see that what they project in terms of depletion from those fields is 6.7% a year, even assuming that governments and countries invest in them. You see that falls off a cliff from 2010 onwards. So you've got to go on from 85 million barrels a day up to 103 million barrels a day in their scenario, and this massive gap, I'm trying to use my PowerPoint with my arms here, this massive gap looking something like a crocodile's jaws by the time we get to 2030, 22 years from now. And this, again, one statistic, if you remember one thing, this is the IEA, this is not the PCIS. What have we got to do? You've written about this countless times in the FT. What have we got to do to close that gap in the crocodile's jaws 22 years from now? Do you know what we've got to do? We've got to find more than 6 Saudi Arabias. More than 6 Saudi Arabias, according to the IEA. And, you know, I'm sorry, but I don't think so. And neither do they. When you hear Mr. Takin from the IEA give his presentations, you know, he's the Secretary General of the IEA. You can't say much. You have to read his body language. He doesn't think there's a snowball's chance in hell that we're going to come close to this. You know, Houston, we really do have a problem. So sorry, I ranted on a bit there, but you know, these were the 4 points. And as for the tone, of course, we should always use confrontation language in our debates, never conflict language. Calling someone a flat earther is classic conflict language, and one shouldn't do it. It doesn't help.
Excellent. Well, that's a very good note on which to open up the debate for highly confrontational but not conflicted discussion, I hope. Anyone who wants to come in? Who wants to get in first with a point, a question, anything? Yes, you sir, in the coat and scarf.
I'd just like to know.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we've got.
I'd just like to know from both sides of the debate, where do we go from here? I know it's a simple question, but it might put it out there.
Oh, go on. Yeah, what's your thought?
Well, I think we'll continue as we are doing now, with the blessing of people who have been warning in the last few decades about peak oil. The public opinion is conscious that oil is running out and we have to find alternatives. And there will be a reduction in demand, reduction in dependence on oil and on energy in general. And I think overall the system would solve itself. We shouldn't sit back and say it will solve itself. No, we have to make efforts, encourage politicians, encourage oil industry, executives and so on to take risks and take policies, issue policies which will reduce demand, dependence on oil and so on and so forth. We have to be active in it, but I don't think we should be alarmist. That is really my main point, that some of the peak oil people cause alarm and a feeling of pending crisis already happening or maybe next year or two. And I think that really is not really well placed. Be aware of it, advertise it, and in debates and meetings saying it is yes, but going too far, causing alarm, I think it wouldn't happen. But generally what we are doing, I think all the public policies around the world, governments are on reducing oil, finding oil, more oil, finding alternatives. All the government policies are around the world, particularly now with the new administration, they are getting more and more investment in alternatives like yourselves and so on, giving grants, etc.
Yeah.
I think this will go smoothly. I don't think there will be a crisis, there will not be a crunch. That is my argument.
One point I'd like to make just about where we go now in the immediate future is that we have a tremendous oversupply of oil. In fact, right now, there's so much oil at what's called Cushing, the place where the US oil futures contract gets settled. They don't know what to do with it all. They've run out of storage space because you know, all the tanks they've got there are full to overflowing. The price, as everyone will know, has absolutely plummeted. It was up, getting on for $150 in July last year. Now it's about $40. There is an enormous amount of spare productive capacity in the world, particularly in the OPEC countries, which they're not using at the moment. Saudi Arabia, what would you say? I mean, Saudi Arabia alone probably could produce
11 and a half, I think.
Right. So getting on for getting on for more than 4 million barrels a day, more than it's currently producing.
Yes.
Saudi Arabia could be doing. And demand for oil actually fell last year in total, and is very likely to fall again this year. So, and obviously it's taken a severe world recession to do it, but it shows that demand can be managed. And actually I think I would be much less pessimistic than you about the prospects for demand management. And I mean, as you say, just a very simple thing, the fuel efficiency of American cars is a scandal. There is an enormous amount more that could and will be done there, and that can be replicated in different countries in different ways over and over and over again. We can and will have to clearly get smarter about using oil. But I think that is one of the ways that we're going to adjust. And so again, I suppose that's another bit of evidence perhaps to be a bit more optimistic right now than some people would suggest. So, sorry, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just a reflection on timescales. I'm actually not optimistic. I'm optimistic on one level because we've got a new administration who's saying all the right things. But I've spent a long time wandering around between different administrations and Capitol Hill in Washington to know that just because there's a desire to do something, it doesn't necessarily mean it happens. There can be enormous spanners in the works, and that depends on how the Congress reacts to it. To give you an example, we first went to Washington in December 1999, basically calling for disclosure of revenue streams because that's what we have where we live. In Europe, in any European jurisdiction or the United States, you can sit at your desk, even in 1999, and you can access what Exxon, for example, or BP pays to your government. It's there. Try doing it in a country like Angola or Congo, Brazil, or so on. It's absolutely impossible. So the idea that a company should be accountable around those revenue streams and disclose them in a country where, say, 90%, which is what the situation was in Angola at the time, of income stream, was coming from this one resource. The idea that that's kind of somehow controversial, for me it was an absolute no-brainer it should have been done. And here we are now a decade later almost, and we have just got the very first stages of delivery in a few countries. We have massive obfuscation, and I'm talking about delivery of an absolutely very basic accountability mechanism. So against that backdrop, I'd like to remind people of what happened in Poznan and the level of debate around the climate change situation, and more recent science that says that in fact climate sensitivity, which Jeremy could probably better define than me, but I won't go into here, seems to be, if you include long-term feedbacks, much higher than otherwise. You come to the very rapid conclusion that all our targets are wrong, that 2 degrees C, for example, that Europe puts out is actually quite an issue around sort of despeciation events and so on. There are major consequences for stabilizing only at 2 degrees. And on top of that, the targets, in order to hold to 2 degrees, don't have a great likelihood of even succeeding with 2 degrees. So the reason I'm raising this is that you were saying, rightly, yes, we can invest more money, and yes, we may well get more oil out, yes, perhaps in Iraq or other places. But my point basically is we've got to the stage now after 20 years of basically messing around and non-delivery over the climate debate, we actually don't have the time to do that. We cannot afford to do it. We have to get off this, and it seems to me this incentive that we have, you mentioned alarmism and so on. I've never seen politicians so alarmed as $147. I'd actually classify it as panic, and misinformed panic as well. And so I think they're very good at alarming themselves, frankly. So, and you know, we're in a recession where we've got a glut. But what happens when we come out?
Speculative trading, not
Well,
oil running out.
there wasn't a lot of flexibility in supply there. There wasn't a huge amount. There really wasn't at the final stages. Who was going to pump more, and frankly, how long could they keep going? And so when we come back up again, what happens when we get the next spike? Because right now we're cancelling projects, and I don't know how much that affects the estimation of 2013, but I think some of the front-end ones now, which money would have been going into, were part of the equation that takes us to 2013. Now, we might have dived off the cliff in terms of demand, but I'd say we're probably also diving off the cliff in terms of new stuff coming on stream. That's going to be increasingly delayed, notwithstanding the issues of Kashagan and technicalities and what have you. So I just think we have an element of an emergency around the combination of these things that we really have to get our ass in gear, pardon the expression, like there's no tomorrow. Otherwise, the train crash is going to happen. And it might not happen at 2013, maybe it gets delayed another year. But from a climate change point of view, we can't afford to do this. We have to move.
Though I think there's potentially a very interesting tension between the climate change debate, excuse me, between the climate change debate and the peak oil debate, which
Very
you
much.
might want to explore in a bit. But go on, Jeremy, you wanted to say something?
Well, why don't I respond to that? Because then I can sort of answer as all what we said in the task force. And paraphrasing simply but accurately, our advice to government, and we tried to engage government in this process, the Department of Business, not with any success. But our advice was, you know, let's be proactive, because the solution technologies are demand destruction first and foremost, the single most important thing that any of us can do. And then the alternatives, a big family of alternatives, 50 families of clean tech that, you know, are inspiring and exciting Silicon Valley venture capitalists now. There's a green industrial revolution underway anyway. Let's just accelerate the damn thing. I mean, we can engineer a soft landing for the energy security problem. It's not just about peak oil as well. It's about, you know, people at the end of your pipelines and your tanker routes that you might not necessarily want to have as partners that you're dependent on. Let's, you know, deal with all these problems and the climate problem at a pace that's faster than we have been entertaining. And if you look at the policy prescriptions for climate change, generalizing, the annual figures tend to be 2–3% to get you to the deep cuts in emissions that we need. Now, of course, as you said, the chances are we're going to have to go faster than that, because the science news just gets worse and worse. But if you believe that we face a rapid descent scenario, you know, you'd be looking at perhaps wanting to get out of oil within 20 years. Yeah. So, you know, if that was your target, we said in the report, then you're talking only about 5% a year. And, you know, if you start getting on that track, maybe you can soften the landing. Of course, if it's what I said earlier about a collapse of oil-producing countries, you know, initially a little bit and then increasingly holding back their exports for their own domestic use, then you have a whole order of magnitude different problem. And you really do have to go fast, and you might, you know, not be able to, you know, plug the gap. And that's, you know, what we want to head off. But whatever we do, we can't do what we're doing at the moment, which is institutionally and governmentally pretending that there is no problem. We've tried to engage. Richard Branson has waved this report in front of you know, Gordon Brown and the Chancellor. We've done everything we can to bring the debate into the heart of government. No success yet. You know, one has to be sympathetic with them. God knows they've got problems enough without this as well. But, you know, there's no point in our digging our way out of the credit crisis only to be hit by this tsunami, which some people think that they can see coming, and growing numbers of people and authoritative people. think that they can see coming. Yeah.
But which, I mean, an interesting point about oil producers wanting to keep back their oil for themselves when things get hard. Presumably, I mean, it's not really going to be a problem though, is it? Because they'll always want to swap it for football clubs and newspapers instead of, you know, there's always going to be something we can offer them.
Well, I don't think so. And, you know, you've been to the Middle East as well, and let me give my impression. I mean, the last time I was out there, talking to developers about alternative energy, as one does in the day job, you know, I encountered never anything less than real alarm and sometimes flat panic about where they're going to get their electricity from. Now, all along the Gulf Cooperation Council states, and of course, you know, they're hoping it's going to come from gas, but Qatar is all gassed out. You know, they've got contracts sold and promised all over the place. They're having technical problems in their gas field there, and already in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, they've started burning oil in the power plants. And I suppose the single most scary thing I've read in all the, you know, sad scholarship I do on this stuff of an evening and weekend is an interview, not in your paper, the Wall Street Journal, with head of the electric utility in Saudi Arabia, and he was asked, you know, what are you going to do? You're going up from 20 odd gigawatts. Sorry, I beg your pardon, 30 odd gigawatts to 50 odd gigawatts in just 5 years. Where's it coming from? And you know, the empty quarter was supposed to hold gas. Shell's been exploring there, but it turns out it's not called the empty quarter for nothing. You know, he said, well, the great majority of it is going to come from oil. We're going to burn oil in the power plants.
Before the next question.
Yeah.
To which America would turn around and say, wait a minute, you can't do that. That's our oil. But
Sorry,
you know, it's
You're
worrying.
talking about the environment.
Yeah.
We're talking about oil all the time. Let's not forget that coal, for in general consumption and also for electricity especially, is a major fuel. And all the
That's
countries
where
are
you get
using
the-
it. That's
that's
right.
where
And
you get
all the
the supply.
forecast IEA and so on, you can use my PowerPoint stuff. Coal consumption is going to go up as well as oil.
And however,
and its contribution to CO2 and also corrosive and particulates and so on to the environment is even worse than an oil.
if you believe the existing figures, we've got something like 40 years of oil. We've got 200 years of
That's
coal.
right, so
There's a
no
lot more coal in the
limitation of
world
supply
than
on
there is
coal.
oil.
But from environmental view, we have to
There's a
handle
flow
that.
rate, yeah, but
Sorry,
just
just want to-
in terms of the stuff being there, there's a lot of it there. Sorry, someone wanted to come in. Sorry, we've got lots of people now. You at the back there, and then
So
yeah, you.
First question is, I suppose you're all preaching to the converted here, and I'd imagine you are around the rest of the country as well. So what's the problem at political level with persuading people of your argument?
Well, let me replay what I was told at the Department of Business, and but that's what I was told. There's 40 years of supply, and this is BP has, you know, I have lots of friends in BP. I know the company very well, and I try and politely confront them with this. I think their argument that there's 40 years of supply is really unfair and sells the problem down the, you know, really sells it badly, because it's all about the flow rates. It's not about the reserves. If you take the reserves figures, 1.2 trillion barrels of supposedly proved reserves, we say in our report we think at least 300 billion barrels of it has simply been invented for political reasons, but you know, let's just set that aside for a minute. You divide that by 85 million barrels a day, you get 40 years. Well, I mean, how helpful is that to the debate, you know? And now I've lost my track completely.
Political obstacles. What is it that stops people?
Yeah, I think at the DTI, the argument was we've got 40 years of supply, go away, come back in, you know, maybe 25 or 30 years. They didn't say that, but that was their impression. To which my response was, and these are really senior civil servants, you know, people I've known for quite a long time, been served on government task force and all that. To which my response was, well, let's come at it as a business risk assessment. You may think this is vanishingly low probability, but you will not doubt that it's very high consequence. If you've got your asset assessment wrong, in the same way we now know the banking industry has, systemically and dangerously, that's high consequence, even if you think it's low probability. So let's have a, you know, as though we were business people doing a risk assessment, let's sit down, government and industry, and do this thing. To which the response was, no, We're not going to do that. It would be too risky. I promise you that was the word used. Risky, too risky. So at this point, of course, I'm desperately trying to fight to keep my orientation. Why is it too risky? It's too risky because if we did this, and then the fact that this task force existed leaked out, we might scare the horses and create negative effects. So it's too risky to do the risk assessment. That was the government line. What the government line is right now, I have absolutely no idea, but I imagine that it's way down the list of priorities. And it's so sad because, you know, it's all in the same, the Green New Deal, they're talking about the Green New Deal to deal with the financial crisis. It's all part of the thing. We just accelerate all that green infrastructure and alternatives, and, you know, we're having at least a crack at dealing with the problem.
I was going to say, on number 10 Downing Street, they still have the results of a petition where they were asked to comment about peak oil and the consequences. I can't remember the exact wording, I'm paraphrasing. But basically, they cited 2005 IEA report. So my first point is, couldn't they have noticed there was a 2006, a 2007, and now a 2008? And obviously they missed it. And then they say there's not a problem until 2030.
Yeah.
And that's literally as far as it goes.
They have the 40-year thing on the number 10 website. It's right there, not an issue.
And
we've got 40 years of supply. We'll worry about it later.
Sorry, yes, you had a point or a question. Yeah.
In the effort of decreasing the demand for oil, what do you think are the relative importance of policy regulation versus technological new inventions, and addressing consumer awareness, and how does that differ between first world countries and upcoming economies?
Do you want to come on?
Well, in Saudi Arabia, where there's cheap oil, of course, they have less concern about oil running out. But in the United States, they are concerned, especially because there is this fear of Middle East and the pro-Israeli lobby and so on within the U.S. saying that, and President Obama has said that he wants to reduce dependence on oil from Middle East and Venezuela away by conservation within 10 years. So there is awareness there. It is there, but it varies in different countries on dependence on oil, whether that has to be reduced or not. But I want to say it is other energies as well. It is coal, use of coal, that in China they are building one power plant using coal one a week or something like this. You know, so looking at the global scale, there are different priorities, and we tell the Chinese, no, we should not do that. The poor, 1 billion, 1.3 trillion people, and they want to have aspirations for higher standard of living and so on. It's a very difficult thing of how to handle it. Each country has its own national priorities, and yet the problem is a global one. How do we together? There's economic recession now, the financial, these serious problems, competition. Within the European Union, there is no really coherent energy policy as a whole. Each country, the Germans make deals with the Russians, the North pipeline gas coming there, Poles say something else, Italians say something else. And I think that is really, you have a very good question, and the answer, I'm just trying to say I don't know the answer, but the problem is much bigger than we think.
I'd like to make one suggestion, if I can, which is the price. First, second, and third, it's the price of oil that really affects demand, and that is why arguably the fall of $100 in the price of oil over the past 6 months is the worst thing that's happened to the energy system and to this whole debate, that really in terms of persuading people to think very hard about how much oil they're using, and to think hard about alternatives and other forms of energy, and indeed actually about other ways of finding oil so that we can prolong the period where there will still be some oil for us to use. A high oil price is a very good thing, and I think, you see these ideas flying around about use of taxation or some way of managing the market, that we can hold the oil price up, which I think, if that could be made to work, would be a very good thing.
We probably all agree on that point.
Yes, price is the main mechanism. I didn't want to repeat again. The $147 led to so many projects to reduce demand for oil and energy and so on. But now we have, I think we have discussed it or not, there's a danger becoming complacent, the low price, companies investing less in finding more oil for us. So when as we say, inshallah, when the economy recovers again in a few years' time and demand for energy oil raises, there is supply lagging behind because companies have been pushing
it's not
back.
just a danger, it's,
Not
it's
only
happening,
oil,
right?
not
It's-
only oil, everything.
yeah.
You see, and alternatives as well. They will all be pushed back because they have high cost. They could have been marginal or profitable with help at $100 and so on. At $30, $40, many of these unfortunately could be pushed back. So again, policy push, awareness, but I'm saying not alarmist. Even with this scenario which I said, I'm sure in 2015 there would not be a shortage of oil because of peak.
Isn't that something to be alarmed? That one thing, isn't that something to be alarmed about? That the price of oil is so far below the marginal cost of production that nobody is doing anything. They're
No, we
cancelling
are aware of
projects
it. We
every
are
day.
talking about
Aren't you
it.
alarmed
I'm
about
saying
that?
it. But it's not a cause of alarm. We have to enjoy our life, go home and watch TV and so on.
If I may, that's kind of like a sticking your head in the sand kind of
No,
approach.
no, I don't think so.
I think I was just going to say about policy. I think that the price is, of course, a signal, but there's an utter disconnect between policies at a government level and trying to drive us in the right direction. And we've lived for 20 years in this laissez-faire world where everything is left to the market, and I'm sure there's all sorts of things we can do with markets to hijack the market in order to drive economies of scale and all the rest of it. I don't think that's so much in debate. But the kind of, we've seen what happens when you pull back completely and just let everyone get on with it. You get all sorts of excesses. And given the urgency of the climate problem, you're right to raise coal as a problem, for example. It seems to me that if we're going to have a crunch, we're going to spend so much political capital dealing with the consequences of an oil crunch that everyone's going to go like a bunch of headless chickens into everything else. So we'll go into coal to liquids, we'll go into gas to do this, and then we'll have crunches in other places because in the end it will come down to infrastructure, speed of development, flow rates and all the rest of it. And then we'll have then we'll have something to panic about. And we won't achieve moving in the right direction from a climate point of view.
So, Samantha, but you wanted to come in. Oh. No.
Well, it's just, if I understand correctly, energy consumption is directly linked to economic growth. And it seems so far, in terms of our economy growing, we haven't, like they said, taken great action in terms of cutting demand so much. I mean, you made some citing about how we have reduced since 1970. But is that enough? I mean, even if that trajectory continued, how would that be enough? And right now we are seeing energy demand fall because the economy is terrible. So, but isn't the whole world working to try and reverse that trend? So what now?
Shall I?
Yeah, go on.
Well, I said that this is numbers, the GDP of the United States and the number of barrels, the quantity of oil in barrels they use per year to generate so much $billions or trillions of dollars of actual GDP in real terms. If you divide it per unit of GDP, the number of barrels which were used in 1974 or so, before the oil price increase, is now half of it in 2007.
Per GDP.
The figure per unit of GDP in real terms. So there is production, people using, consuming, traveling, etc. The affluent society, over 30 years, US has become very affluent. And yet, the amount of oil per unit of GDP, 2007 data, not the recent decline in the economy, has been halved. And that trend is continuing. And the United States has done it. Why not other countries? We can't expect the Chinese and Indians and so on to use the 1930s Stalin style of steel industry. Obviously, this technology will be transferred, efficient cars and so on. That was my argument, that there is this trend of reducing the demand for oil, being more efficient, and awareness that there should be conservation of energy and oil in general.
But doesn't that have something to do with a lot of industry in the U.S. has just been shipped
No.
to shipped abroad to China, to
Some of
India?
it, for sure.
Partly, yes. Partly, yes.
Absolutely.
Partly, yes, because the manufacturing, energy-intensive economy that the United States had, it has now shifted to services. The U.S. GDP is quite a bit, but I don't think that is the only explanation. I think the actual structure in the economy has become less dependent on oil, and there is much more room, looking at Lovins and others, Amy Lovins, there is much room to reduce energy. And again, I repair, it's not only oil is not the culprit. Oil is a very convenient, very condensed form of energy that we can use compared with coal. It's clean and so on. It is energy in general, coal the rest. It is awareness that to reduce energy. We are much more conscious now to put the lights out when we go out. You know, whereas before we were not. I think these are what I'm saying is optimism. And we should not be alarmed so much. But we should not sit back and become complacent either, you know.
But I mean, just another supporting point in that, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, does also say they think probably the developed countries now have hit peak demand. I mean, you've heard this idea they've been talking about, that probably between the US, the European Union, Japan, they're now using about as much oil as they ever will. It's been flat for a year or two now, and they think it may go up a little bit, may go down a little bit, but broadly it'll be the same forever because they're getting the rate at which they're getting better, more efficient in the use of oil will offset that effect of economic growth that you're talking about. The issue, of course, is the developing world. It's China, it's India, it's what happens when every family in India gets a car, what happens when every family in China gets a car. That's where that very strong growth you could still expect to be. But in the developed world, it's probably about topping out right now.
That's right. It's a level that's utterly unsustainable. It's absolutely from a climate change point of view. I mean, we may have increased our energy efficiency, but we've doubled the number of vehicles. So the net effect is the same amount of emissions and the same, you know, an increased emissions and increased consumption. So it's great. I mean, we should celebrate our increased efficiency, but we seem to cancel that out by expansion.
So you wanted to say something?
Hi, we've been talking about avoiding a crunch and getting a soft landing for this. I was wondering whether it would be possible when the international community meet in Copenhagen, for example, to get this soft landing through carbon trading and all of those schemes that are going ahead.
I'm not an expert on it. You are a more expert. You follow it more closely than I do.
No, I don't hold out your hopes. We've got to turn the language now into emissions and not getting off oil for energy security reasons, which is what the peak oil argument is about. What businesses are being told now in this country by the government. There was a meeting convened by Prince Charles a couple of months ago. We were all invited along, 160 companies, all the CEOs, chairman, senior people sat down, given the latest briefing from the Met Office, from the Potsdam Institute, from the British Antarctic Survey, all the horrible stuff that they're finding now about climate. And the head of climate at the Foreign Office said, what this means is the world is going to have to go zero carbon on energy because there are inevitable emissions from food. And so we're going to have to cut to zero, not 60%, not 80%, it's zero carbon. And here's where, good news kicks in, because there are these technologies. Your point about does economic growth have to tie in with the use of energy? No, because you've got 150 families of technology right now with most of the investors, or no, not most, that's wrong. The most favored avenue for investors' money is into clean tech right now, if you look at the stats. So we could run the world a different way, but we'll never do it through just carbon trading. We'll have to do it, every country, by Manhattan and Apollo projects, tackling the emissions reductions at source. You just look at what happened the other day, €1 billion of money that was supposed to be used in the emissions trading scheme was just raised by the energy-intensive companies across Europe in cement and glass and the rest, just to bolster their balance sheets. And that is not even game playing, that's crude, thumbing your nose at the efforts of politicians to bring the problem under some sort of control. And then, if you imagine all these unemployed investment bankers, if it begins to take off, you know what's going to happen? They're all going to get involved in the carbon game and start their whole game. It'll be a nightmare. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but please don't think that there is an avenue for salvation down here. We've got to, we've got to have the Apollo projects and the Manhattan projects and cutting this stuff at source.
Thanks. Now, I think we're running pretty low on time. I can see quite a few people still want to come in. How much longer do we have? What's your... Yeah, okay, well, let's take a... Perhaps we'll take a quick roundup. Yeah, sorry, you say... I know you were trying to come in.
Yeah, I've got a very quick one. The panels all agreed that the big driver of demand is price. So my question for each of you is, if you had the fiscal wherewithal and the agreement of OPEC, where would you fix the price?
It's a very good question. Just take a couple more. There's two more over there, and then we'll do one last round after this if we've answered these.
Given the, I guess, the interrelation between, making clean fuel, finding a way to, move people over onto better ways of generating energy, and the costing, if you were Shell or BP now, having posted, massive profits this year in a declining market, where would you invest those funds? Would it be continuing the exploration and extraction of fields that are there, or would it be in the clean energy sector? How would you personally do that?
It might be a slightly good question to end on, just a simple point. As experts, because I rack my brain with this, from a global warming perspective, given all the multiple complicated variables, that have to be controlled to make climate change stop, do you think we'll make it? I mean, and I know you'll come back and say, we hope so, but I'd actually like to know, be pessimistic if necessary, because I don't think we will.
You're right, that would be a good one to end. So let's just quickly go around. There's, I think you at the back there. Yeah, let's, and then there's a couple at the front, I think.
If this energy famine does occur in the next 5-10 years, how does a country like UK position itself to actually survive energy-wise? Nobody's discussed nuclear. Is that actually an option, or can we fill our energy supply with solar panels, wind, wave? Is that enough?
Right, and then a couple of you had wanted to ask them?
I'll forget.
It seems to me that a lot of arguments, particularly on the global warming front, break down because of the scenario in terms of growth in India and China. And if that's the case, I wonder whether, as you sort of think about ways in which you can develop clean tech and so forth, whether you see any scenarios in the future which are more green tech protectionist in that respect, i.e. that if you're Europe or you're America, that you can develop your own priorities in terms of what you do, and you can influence the growth of those industrial markets in India and China and consumer markets by setting your own thing. So not to say we will be protectionist in future, but to be green protectionist. I just wondered how seriously those kind of scenarios are ever considered.
Thank you. And one final, I think you, were there two down the front here, or just the one? Yeah, okay.
I think each of those ties into the possibility of presenting a win-win case. And if we're going to try and build advocacy, and I'm here partially because my son's become sort of born-again peak oilist, and I'm trying to understand the arguments and engage with him. And it's been very useful from that point of view. But I think there needs to be a way in which we can support people making difficult political decisions by building popular opinion around the way in which we can all gain by reducing dependence on oil. And when presented in the ways that you've been doing, it feels like a no-brainer. There has to be a way of getting that through, and people like yourselves who have positions to influence.
Hello there. I should probably say, first of all, I'm a journalist with Reuters in the energy sector, but I am here just in a personal capacity just to enjoy this. But question I was going to have was regarding price, because you all said that you thought that, number one, price was the number one deciding factor in demand, and secondly, that the prices need to be higher, given that the collapse in oil price that there has been. Now, first of all, just as a devil advocate's point, could it not, a lot would argue that global GDP growth has a bigger influence on the demand outlook than prices? And secondly, can the world economy handle, even when it comes out of this recession, or slowdown, as you might call it, the, say, $75 for oil? Because that's a figure that we'd never even seen until 2006. And now it's the figure that's most commonly bandied around as the ideal price for oil from governments and producers alike. But can the economy handle that when it starts to grow again?
Right, well, thanks very much. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to take those in two waves. So if we, firstly, thoughts on, where might the oil majors put their money? The idea of, is there a case for green protectionism? Is there a role for nuclear? And then I'm going to come back quickly on what's the price and are we going to make it? Just to end on. Yeah, so anyone want to pitch in on any of those? First, go on.
Well, on the price of oil is to be decided by the market. Saudi Arabia or the President of the United States and others, they cannot say what the price of oil should be. Saudi Arabian king has said $75 is a good price. But I don't believe this year, next year, they will get to that price. The price, because of the US global economy, the price is down and below that. So price of oil is determined really by the market, supply and demand. You might blame the financial speculators and so on, pushing it the other way and that. But basically, it is supply and demand, a bit distortion or pushing increasing fluctuation because of the financial speculators. And that is, I think, what the story is on the price.
Sorry, well, I think we better just, the question is, should it be, I suppose, determined by the market? And if you were the benevolent dictator of the world, what price would you set?
I don't think I would try to manipulate the price. I think just leave it there.
Okay.
By doing these other alternatives, by encouraging conservation, you see, there's no free market in the world. Even the United States is not a free market. It's not talking about oil. The way they have controlling the interest rates and so on, they are influencing. So why not manage the energy market? They will do it at the end. But there's no simple one solution. It's a holistic social economic system.
Thatcher said you can't buck the market. I mean, it's there whether we like it or not. So the price is going to be set. I don't know. I profess to understand the laws of supply and demand beyond being able to say, well, it obviously is going up and down because of the market, which comes back to it's exactly what you were saying.
Jeremy, any thoughts?
Well, I think there are two things that we have all agreed on here. One was the price, and then in different interventions, the point about investment, because this industry is not investing at anything like the level that is, and the IEA makes this point as well, anything like the level it needs to stave off the very crisis that we're talking about. So it's tremendously important that that price signal is got right. So what I'd do is I'd set a floor price. I wouldn't set a ceiling. I wouldn't fix one price, but I'd make sure there was a floor price. And what would it be? It would be above the marginal cost of production. It would allow a healthy oil industry. Now, I'm an environmentalist, but I think it's really important that in terms of managing the transition, we have a healthy oil industry. And we don't have one at the moment. It's so dysfunctional. They're firing thousands of people just to influence their next quarter's figures as they report them. And they know damn well that the price is going to go up again. They're going to go and have to look. It's really dysfunctional. And that, I think, is something we should all be alarmed about, actually.
I saw just on the price thing again, I saw a graph showing a marginal break-even price of around $70 to $80. There's some stuff cheaper than that, but like offshore Angola is $80 now.
Yeah,
so
it's coming down because
it might come down because of the
Okay, well, I'm sorry if we haven't had a chance to get to everyone's question in full. Perhaps there may be some time for a bit of a chat afterwards, and no doubt we can thrash these issues out for a whole lot longer. Final thoughts, though, from all of you. Question, are we going to make it? Are we going to get... are we going to address climate change before it kills us all? Are we going to work out some way to secure our energy supplies such as we will be able to retain some kind of civilized lifestyle? Optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, on the climate, I don't want to comment here, make comments, I'm no expert on it, but there are people who, again, are alarmists, or they say it's not going to be as bad as bad. But put that aside. On the oil, I think we come back to the peak debate. And remind you, as a last point for you to bear in your mind, that we had the Malthusians, I think the better term of pessimists, optimists is Malthusians and cornucopians. And I think the issue is really between the two as for the supply of oil. We were talking about reserves. 1960s was a big peak of the discovery of oil all over the world, especially Middle East, super giant fields, but we have been adding reserves since then. I had some numbers and charts to show in my imaginary PowerPoint slides. Between 1995 and 2003, using the data about IHS Energy or petroconsultants that people have been using. The amount of new discoveries in this 8 years were about 150 billion barrels of oil, but the growth of reserves by increasing the recoverable oil in the known discoveries, they added 470 or 450 billion barrels. And I think over this period, we have found much more oil than oil which has been consumed. So this is a bit more on the optimistic side. We talked on this oil supply and oil reserves, but again, I come into developing it, whether people are investing or not, that is the issue. If they don't, these reserves would not produce something. On the UK, where there's a shortage and so on, I think we are falling into this protectionism that each country has to have its own oil and natural and energy resources. Why emphasizing that? Why not, as we have globalization, trade, capital moving, why not trading and getting energy from this country and that country? And if we have that, that would really cause a great deal of distortion. It is good to have public policy, encourage people, and so on and so forth. But to pushing it too much on influencing the market, I think would have a reverse effect. Let's accept that there are countries that have coal, oil, and others that they don't, and the trade will be healthy. Gas from Russia and so on, why not? Let's not politicize it, and there is too much, makes too much worry of it. And that makes me still optimistic, or not cornucopian, but something which I think is not a crisis, is not a major shock. There is not going to be a crunch. That is my personal
Thank you very much. So, Simon, what about you? You optimist or Malthusian?
In terms of climate change, I went to the Poznan meeting because I wanted to have a view for myself, what I thought about this process. And I can't think of a more unfit for purpose process that I've ever seen in my entire life. I cannot frankly see how it will deliver, but I think the game changer comes up elsewhere. So I'm both utterly pessimistic about the process, I just can't see it, frankly. I just came from Davos, and there was a discussion in the Davos meeting with Ivo de Boer and various other participants who were in Poznan, and the discussion they had some 6, 7, 8 weeks, whatever it is, post-Poznan, about what we have to get to in Copenhagen, and nothing, frankly, has happened in between to encourage me. There's an utter disconnect between what they were saying in Davos and what was said in Poznan, or what was achieved in Poznan. So the process, I just can't see it. I think Obama's administration could be a game changer. So let's hope they do. To mitigate against that, I think on Capitol Hill there's utter ignorance of this issue. There is absolutely no real deep-seated understanding within policy-making circles at all, apart from a few notable examples. Just a comment on carbon price. Someone mentioned carbon price earlier. IEA in their 12th of November latest update talked about a trajectory of getting to 450 parts per million, which is based around the idea of 2 degrees, I think, if I've got this right, which is based around the 3-degree level of climate sensitivity. And they said that they needed a carbon price of $180 or $170, I forget, but somewhere of that magnitude, which brings us back to carbon trading. We've never got that kind of price. So unless we can have a sustained price like that, I can't frankly see how it has any impact at all. And bear in mind that 450 parts per million, you used the word alarmist, the science is the science. I think the thing that's alarming is what the science is saying.
Well, there are other scientists who challenge it as well.
I'm sorry, we will have to...
So my basic point basically is that we need to move faster than that, so the price needs to be higher than that.
Okay, good. And Jeremy, finally your thoughts, are you Malthusian and proud of it?
No, I think hope lives, and that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. I do think it's going to be about renaissance. I think it's going to get far, far worse before it gets better, because we do have 3 crises, and I think we should use those words unapologetically. We have the financial one, we have the carbon one through climate. We're going to, I fear, have the energy one as well, and we're going to have to deal with them all in the round. And it's how we deal with them, knowing that we have technologies, available that could make them all, much not disappear, but manageable. It's how we face up to that as a matter of global mobilization, as though for war. That's going to be the ultimate test of us, I think, as a civilization. And then if we do that, we'll start seeing all the knock-on effects. So, green tech priorities and protectionism, yes, economies will be run, you know, by energy at home. And there won't be so much global trade, but then so much global trade is completely dysfunctional and very destructive. You know, there will be good things, the democratization of energy, the democratization of production because of local energy. And your question, you know, about people getting involved, the transition towns movement, you can see it in the UK. The most exciting, I think, social movement at the moment is the transition towns, where grassroots activists are getting together that have had, in many cases, no previous involvement in activism and planning for this power down, as it's often called, because they can see it coming, even if our politicians can't. So, you know, from all this, you can construct a massive, great silver lining to the cloud, but not quickly and not before it gets a lot worse inevitably. And I think we'll have to see off some other monsters that have yet to emerge, like the rise of fascism. Again, unfortunately, I hope that one's wrong, but you know, we're living in a country where in the last social survey, 1 in 5 people said they are able to imagine a situation in which they would vote for the British National Party. 1 in 5 before we slid towards the recession or depression or whatever it's going to be. So we'll have all that to deal with as well. But despite it, I'm an optimist.
It is being so cheerful as keeps you going, I'm sure. All right, well, thank you all very much. Thank you.